Climate change and flood history. The climate is always changing, and floods will always come and go. And except for failures of man-made dams, floods are a force of nature. But you wouldn't know that by listening to climate alarmists. Here's one by CNN. Floods are getting worse, and the number of people exposed is 10 times higher than previously thought, study finds. 10 times higher than what? They never say. It's all meant to scare you. And then from the Grist people, on the heels of Europe's devastating floods, warn more is yet to come. Yeah, that's like saying next year the summers will be hot again and the winters will be cold again. And then there's the devastating part. That comes from their so-called study, which is based on climate models, of which none work. But then we have the NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, and they had this cute little symbol with a polar bear in it. And their headline reads, Flooding and Climate Change, Everything You Need to Know. Really? Everything? Let's see. We have flooding facts, flooding causes, flood consequences, flood preparation, and we have flood prevention. Oh my, what about flood history? Without climate history to compare, references to climate change is meaningless. But that's how they operate, folks. If they reveal historic data, they will expose their fraud. And here's my favorite from the United Nations. How a climate change is making record-breaking floods the new normal. The new normal. This is a code word for here comes more propaganda. And so let's look at the data and see what the record-breaking data really looks like. But first, for reference purposes, recall the recent German flood along the Rhine River. This headline reads, European floods killed at least 110 people. German president blames climate change. Of course she blames climate change. Who would ever think of blaming bad forecasting and defective climate models? That would expose the core problem. So, knowing more than 100 died from this climate change event, here's a simple graph of flood-related deaths since 1900. Can you see a trend? Notice this graph shows millions of deaths, not hundreds. Ever wonder why the climate alarmists are unable to see history? They may be blind to history, but we aren't. Now let's look back before the year 1900. Here is a list of the world's 5 deadliest floods. Topping the list, we have 4 million deaths back in 1931. But farther back into 1887, the death toll ranges from almost 1 million to 6 million. And carbon dioxide levels were very low back then. Isn't that amazing? Even farther back to 1642, 350,000 died, and way back to 1530, about 400,000 died, with even less carbon dioxide in the air. It seems like the worst floods, just like the worst wildfires, all occurred when carbon dioxide levels were very low. Maybe that should be the new normal. More CO2 means less severe weather. But let's take a closer look at the 1931 worst flood event in history. As with any disaster, deaths is an important number, but extended consequences can be far-reaching. In addition to the unknown numbers of missing people, there were about 30 million going hungry after the 1931 flood. Then a little closer to home, I'm sure everyone remembers the springtime flood of 1936. All of Eastern America under floodwaters, the headline reads. 100 cities and 14 states affected. See this map insert? Let's take a closer look. Again, this is springtime 1936. Here are the floods along the eastern U.S., and here is the last year of the 7-year Dust Bowl drought. For reference purposes, here's the temperature and carbon dioxide chart over the last 140 years. Here is the 1936 flood event on the timeline. The CO2 levels were only 285 parts per million, way below the current 415 parts per million levels of today. Remember, the historical data show that weather was much more extreme in the past, long before carbon dioxide levels began its rapid rise after 1980. Let's return to the recent German flood to finish up. The Guardian media giant recently reported that climate scientists shocked by scale of floods in Germany. Of course they're shocked. That's what happens when you look at reality through a peephole and ignore history. And then the subtitle says, Deluge raises fears human-caused disruption is making extreme weather even worse than predicted. Wow, the Guardian spinmeisters were hard at work that day. First comes global warming, then climate change, and now human-caused disruption. What next? Climate indigestion, I guess. Shocking, absolutely shocking. So let's look at the shocking scale of those German floods. The Environment and Society portal published an article called Flooding of the Rhine and Elbe Rivers in North German and Dutch Coasts. Here in small print it says, in 1651, a series of floods killed as many as 15,000 people and led to widespread destruction. That was almost 400 years ago, during the Little Ice Age, and of course carbon dioxide levels were very low. The next time the Guardian media giant talks about scale again, they may want to reference this image. It shows the water heights of past floods on the Danube River in southern Germany. Here's the doorway entrance into that building. Here's a closer look at the flood markings. Note where the oldest data is, right here in 1501. And then right below is the year 2013. However, 6 of the 9 worst floods occurred more than 100 years ago. A final note about the media. Most engage in climate alarmism, but sometimes we see some honest journalism. Here's one example. Why are so many people still living on floodplains? Floodplains are well documented and the data goes back hundreds of years, and yet construction continues on known floodplains, which will surely experience other floods in the future. Remember, without knowledge of climate history, claims about climate change have no basis.